this episode of Digitalks, PhD candidate and HASTAC scholar Christopher Peace joins me to discuss his time as a HASTAC scholar, his time with HBW, and the inward nature of humanities research. The Digitalks podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, the Hall Center, and the University of Kansas. You can find us on iTunes, Simplecast, and online at idrh.ku.edu. As always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy. Christopher, thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thanks for having me.
And so to begin, give us a sense of who you are as a person, who Christopher Peace is, your research interests, and generally, just give our audience a sense of who you are.
Okay, yeah. I'm Christopher Peace, and I am a Mississippi native. So I went to undergrad and my master's program in Mississippi. My undergrad was in writing. It was in English, but there was a writing focus, almost a red comp focus. And then I got a master's in literature, where I really leaned in to my interest in Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the first Black anthropologists in the US. So my thesis was about her and conjure. So I'm interested kind of like in religion and spirituality as it pertains to African Americans and in the Black diaspora at large. So I'm here right now. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate here at the University of Kansas, majoring in English as well, with a focus in rhetoric and composition. So I'm really interested in kind of like religious rhetorics, or how religion and spirituality and culture has kind of like rhetorical movement and meaning in various contexts. But specifically for my dissertation, I'm focusing on Hoodoo, which is like an African American set of spiritual practices, spiritual religious practices. And I'm also looking at Hoodoo through the lens of the rhizome. I don't know how deep I need to go with this, but I'll try to be quick. But the rhizome is basically kind of like the opposite of a tree, right? So if you think of a tree, and I don't even want to say opposite, but if you think of a tree, it has like a single tap root, and from whence all things come from the tree. But the rhizome, similar to like crabgrass or ginger root, it has multiple roots. It goes multiple ways. There's really no beginning or end. So everything kind of spills out of the middle. So I'm using that ecological metaphor of connectivity to describe the Hoodoo process in the US, because just like the rhizome can be cut from its root or cut from in a place and planted somewhere else, and it still can grow, I'm saying that Hoodoo did the same thing as an African spirituality replanted on US soil, basically. So I'm interviewing people, or I'm trying to get approved to interview people. I just turned in my IRB to approve this project, to interview people who practice Hoodoo, to see kind of like how their connections and their practices are rhizomatic. So within the academy, really what the extra things that I've done outside of conferences and things like that is work for HBW, which is the Project on the History of Black Writing. So I started really working for HBW under Miriam McGrath when I first came to KU around 2017. So at first I worked on a project with HBW called BBIP, which is the Black Book Interactive Project, where we were taking multiple texts and kind of like categorizing them. So They can be basically more digitally friendly when it comes to research. One of HBW's main tenets is to really bring to the table lesser known Black authors. So these lesser known texts can be more integrated when it comes to current research. So that digital project really helped me be interested in kind of like digital humanities at large. And it was really through Dr. Graham's suggestions that I applied to HASTAC and became a HASTAC scholar. But yeah, so, and also through HBW, I worked with the Zora Festival, and I know we'll talk about that in a second. So really HBW has helped me broaden my research in a lot of ways while doing something meaningful when it comes to recovering lesser known Black author texts. So yeah.
And kind of briefly going off of just for those who may not know, like myself, that much about Hoodoo, what are some I guess some of the other basic tenets of Hoodoo spirituality?
Yes, great question, because I just gotta like skip past that. But yeah, so Hoodoo, I would say, is really a response to the lack, or the severing of African culture and African spirituality. So within U.S. plantations in particular, there's a lot more mixing where like groups of people from the same place couldn't be in the same area. So there's a lot more, multiplicitous cultures from different, groups of people from Africa, just mixed together. So I feel like Hoodoo was this mixture of these spiritualities coming from different cultures in Africa that was used for healing in particular, and to really survive the harsh cultures of white supremacy and slavery in the US. So there's other African diasporic religions that have like been created from plantation slavery. Hoodoo is specific for the United States, really coming from the South of the United States, I would argue. And again, it's used for healing, but also kind of like, defense against stuff that may be out to kill you and things like that. One person that I'm looking at argues that Hoodoo was a real religion, right? So people kind of came together and practiced all of this multiplicitous spirituality as a religion at first. But as Black Americans moved from the South, in the Great Migration and to northern places, Hoodoo's identity changed in ways. So it was more kind of like marketeered, where people were just kind of like selling products because they weren't close to nature anymore. Because Hoodoo is very nature-based. It deals with roots, dirt, moon cycles, so very much a naturalistic spirituality. But yeah, so what my project is trying to do really is kind of outline that lineage of Hoodoo, but also talk to people who's practicing now to see how they define their identity through narrative inquiry. So, yeah, so just in a nutshell, Hoodoo is really kind of like a natural response to the harshness that African Americans go through in the U.S.
And could you tell us a little bit about how Hoodoo is typically practiced?
Right, for sure. I definitely think that a lot of people approach it very differently. I feel like the mainstream culture has kind of like minimized it to just kind of like this, Black superstition, whereas Hoodoo has been kind of like an initiatory process through some families like initiate people into what Hoodoo is. And Hoodoo, to survive in ways, hid behind Christian symbols, or was subverted rather behind Christian symbols. So I do think there's kind of like connection, especially with the Black church and how they approach spirituality and Hoodoo's like creation in the US. I feel like Hoodoo was first, right? And it kind of influences how the Black church approaches Christianity in a very Africanized way. But I would definitely compare it to indigenous spiritualities within, North America. And even like I think there's like a few Mexican based roots that Hoodoo practitioners practice, especially High John the Conqueror, which is like a root that's very popular in Hoodoo, but I think the origins are from a Mexican based plant. So, but yeah.
Yeah. So getting to, I guess, a little bit about your time in the digital humanities. I like to ask this next question because it's sometimes one of those complicated and complex questions. And it's sort of a definitional question about what the digital humanities is. And so I wanted to kind of get your sort of initial sense and thoughts about what it means for a project to be considered a DH project. And I guess what sort of thoughts have you developed over your participation in HBW and BPIP about the digital humanities?
Well, when I think about humanities, I just think about how working within the humanities is talking about what it means to be human, what humanity is, and how to be human in a lot of instances in that way. So I feel like, especially how I've been approaching digital humanities, it's about recovery work in that process of how to be human. It is really recovering a lot of things that may have been inaccessible or missed over this long journey of what it means to be human. So yeah, especially with, my work with HBW, like it really is about reaching back to gather information so it can be used in the future for future context. So yeah, that's what I think when I think of digital humanities, and my involvement, especially as a HASTAC scholar, has been really great to include in my project because Sylvia really helped me find digital tools to help me with how I'm thinking about the rhizome. Because I feel like with digital humanities, it's really not, well, of course, some projects is about the digital only, right? Or what it is to interface the digital and things like that. But I feel like whatever project you have is already digital, right? So whatever we're working with, it can be digital or it's presented digitally in a different way. Like Hoodoo in particular, I feel like the digital part of Hoodoo is very important for people looking for something like this, right? People who kind of need something more than the church to connect to whatever they think spirituality or God is. And I would argue, I don't know if this is true, but this is my analysis. I would argue that a lot of people who are coming back to Hoodoo and other African diasporic practices are doing it through the internet, are doing it through digital means, are finding Facebook groups and other groups to connect with when they don't have that connection in their own communities. So I feel like the digital is very important to what I'm looking at, but personally in my dissertation right now, at least, and this may change, but right now, at least, how I want to interpret my coding from my interviews is through grounded theory, but I want to create a digital rhizome through, I forgot the website. I think it's Graphics Comment or Graph Comments or something. But I want to create a digital rhizome to present my findings or present the thematic repetitions that I find throughout my interviews. So Sylvia helped me find that site. But my time at HASTAC has been great for me to think about spatial rhetorics. It was influential enough that I created a whole list for my comps on space and place. Spatial rhetorics is really what I was interested in when it came to digital humanities, kind of like mapping and things like that. And being a HASTAC scholar really, fired up that interest. Through the HASTAC program, I interviewed this scholar named David Bodenhammer, if I'm saying his last name correctly. I think he is in Indianapolis, like University in Indianapolis. And he was one of the scholars that began spatial humanities. So it was kind of like an extension of GIS. So he had this project called the Digital Religious Atlas of America, where he gathered information about different religions and created graphs and other things on his website. So I interviewed him about that, and it was very great to think about, something that I'm interested in, kind of like religion and other stuff, and how it kind of applies in a more technical way to digital humanities. There's one other or a few other, but again, it's kind of connected to the Zora Festival, which I don't know if you have a whole question about that or not. But for HBW last semester, I was one of the 2 graduate students leading kind of like a public program that HBW does called Black Literary Suite. And we focused on Black film and media. And there was a piece done by Mona Ahmed, but she created a timeline of films, but also kind of used story map to position movies from where they came from, like their author, whoever created the movie, and kind of where they came from, what the movie is about. She positioned it on a map of the US. So that was interesting to work with her to see all the spatial elements, again, when it comes to something that's within African-American humanities.
So I think at this point, it'd be great for you to bring up Zora Neale Hurston and discuss a little bit about who she was. And then you can, if you would go into a little bit of your time working with the Zora Neale Hurston Festival.
Great. Zora Neale Hurston was definitely one of the first Black anthropologists. I'm not sure if she was the first Black female anthropologist in the U.S., but maybe. I have to fact check that. But she was definitely one of the first Black anthropologists in the U.S. who grew up in the town of Eatonville. Eatonville, Florida. And Eatonville, Florida is the first African-American municipality in the United States. So it's the first actual city created and built by and sustained by African Americans. So her father actually was a mayor of the town and also a preacher. She was influenced kind of through him and his religious practices. But her mother died early. But when she grew up and went to the North, she went to school to be an anthropologist. And then she was commissioned to go back to the South to collect folklore. So first she went to her hometown, collected folklore, then she went across the South basically, and ultimately to Jamaica and Haiti, all doing anthropological work. So folklore was really big in her writings, and her ethnographies, but she also was one of the first anthropologists, or one of the first Black anthropologists to go beyond just observant object research, but she was observant participant, right? So she actually participated in Hoodoo culture. She got initiated, and she traces those initiations in Mules and Men, one of her books. But she got initiated in New Orleans, into Hoodoo in particular. So that's kind of how I'm approaching her, of course. But of course, she was one of the leading people in the Harlem Renaissance at her time. And as well as the Chicago Renaissance, when most of her work was published. She kind of, passed away without anyone knowing who she was. And Alice Walker, I think in the 80s or 70s or something, Alice Walker basically finds her grave and puts a marker on it because she was buried unmarked in an unmarked grave. So really, Alice Walker was the one that really resurrected Hurston to academia at large. But, she wrote about Hurston and she kind of like resurrected the importance of looking at her work. So that's kind of a bit about Hurston. And through HBW, I was connected to this group in Eatonville, actually called PEC, which is Preserve the Eatonville Community. And PEC puts on a cultural festival every year around January, at the end of January. The Zora Festival, the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. PEC also has a museum that they feature like different, works every other month or so. So with the Zora Festival, there's usually, before COVID, of course, there was usually kind of like this outdoor part where people would come. There would be musical performances, musical performances and other things to participate in, like food and culture, things to buy. And this is after COVID, they still had the festival. Of course, they didn't have the outdoor part, but this is my third year going to the festival and participating as kind of like a graduate intern. So even though they have the outdoor festival, one of the main parts of the festival as well is kind of like an academic conference. So they have people come, scholars come, and, it's just like a conference, right? So they kind of like incorporate Zora and what we are doing for the theme of the year. So for this year and like for the next 2 years, the theme is Afrofuturism. So it's really interesting to put Zora in conversation with Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism is like, in a very small definition, it's like African or Black science fiction. So science fiction writers who were white, basically, right, would be writing Black people and other people of color in their novels, in their science fiction novels in the future. But in the future, they would still be oppressed, and still be downtrodden by white supremacy, basically. So there's a movement for Black people to kind of like take control of their future narratives. So putting Hurston in that conversation is very interesting because some of the works that she did, especially with spirituality, was very futuristic for her to write about, especially in academia. And also Hurston really wrote in Southern dialect. So when you read her pieces, you'll see that it's kind of like, in the way that the people that she interviewed talked. So that sonic sound part was also very Afrofuturistic in the way to who she was writing to. So my involvement in the festival has been many jobs to like delivering packages places, but also setting up kind of like the guide of the festival, looking at the genres of kind of like travel guides and how do we change that for the festival's purposes? Because, Orlando is right beside Eatonville. So Orlando is a very big tourist destination place. So it's always a good time in Orlando, though, because the food is great. It's just so many options, and the food is really great. So, but yeah.
With all of this experience with HBW and BBIP, and even in your own dissertation project, what advice would you like to pass on, or think would be good to pass on to future humanists and anyone else that's sort of thinking about getting involved in digital humanities?
I think, like, my initial advice, I guess, is that working with humanist work is very personal. I mean, I think with my dissertation, obviously, I've chosen something that, was kind of closer to me, since I'm a practitioner as well, of African diasporic religions at large. But it's still very personal, again, because the humanities is how to be human. So I'm kind of like tracing my own humanity as it is presented, not just in the digital, which is very important for digital humanities, obviously, but also in the spatial and the affective realm and emotional states, right? So like writing about humanity is kind of like a personal inward work that you have to kind of like take upon yourself in various ways. Even if you were writing about something that wasn't a part of you or your identity, it's still very personal on how you deal with humans and what it means to be human. Again, my other advice would just be look for the digital in what you're already interested in. I mean, it's there, right? So you don't necessarily have to think about the digital in ways that is a part, or separate from you, away from you. But it's already there in what you're looking at, or digital representations are already doing some type of rhetorical meaning and how we are positioning language about it, or about our work and our processes. Yeah. And I just think it's needed, obviously. I mean, everything is digital now. So we have to find ways to incorporate it in a way that is accessible, for one, but also that we can understand, or we can have language to use the digital realm to understand the human realm in a better way.
Christopher, thank you for that. There's one thing that I kind of want to ask you about that I thought was interesting that you mentioned about Zora Hurston, was the way that she wrote, and in the sort of the rhetoric that she used. Do you think that there's a lesson there to be learned for academics that are wanting to make their work more accessible to a general audience about the way that Zora herself went about it?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that the way Zora kind of like interfaced academia was very important. Because, I mean, she had two benefactors in particular. One who was Franz Boas, who was he was a big anthropologist, early 1900s, who really focused on cultural relativism. So with cultural relativism, basically, it was saying that, it's saying that Black people's cultures and POC cultures, indigenous cultures, had logic, wasn't worthy to be studied, and wasn't really being compared with European Western cultures and their logics, right? So these cultures have different logics of their own. And I feel like Zora's presentation of Black dialect is saying that there is a logic, there is a meaning to how Black people talk, and we shouldn't change it or dumb it down in ways for other audiences outside of those cultures to understand it. So she really worked to integrate what the Black experience in the South and in other places in the diaspora really meant. And she just presented that work. She, participated in it, and she presented it. It wasn't like a deep interpretation. Obviously she had interpretations, right? But it wasn't like something, else that she wanted to push. She just really wanted to go into these cultures and present their logics. So,
Christopher, thank you for for joining me today and having this conversation about your work, your research interest as a graduate student, as a PhD candidate. So yeah, thank you again for taking the time out of your day to join me for this conversation.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Great. And with that, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Digitalks.